During World War II, we often hear about great battles, heroic victories, and famous generals. But what was the experience of everyday people? For most people, war was a very difficult time. Men were sent off to fight on the battlefields, while many women stayed home to work long hours in factories. Most lost loved ones that were separated from family members, and many had to flee their homes and did not know what the future would hold. What would life be like in a week, a year? They didn't have those answers. But there were those who had hope. They believed that they would survive this dark time. Today you will learn about a tragic moment in World War II's history. It's called the Siege of Leningrad. A siege happens when an army surrounds a city and cuts the people off from supplies like food, medicine, and water. The Siege of Leningrad affected everyday people living in the city. Today this city is called St. Petersburg, and it was once the capital of the Russian Empire. The Siege of Leningrad is a difficult story, and it is important to understand how war can hurt many people. But the siege is also a story about hope and resilience. Even in the darkest of times, the citizens of Leningrad refused to give up. This is the story about the brave people of Leningrad and the 872-day siege.
Historians, welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Are you as excited about this episode as I am? I sure hope so. We're about to jump into another story filled with adventure and learn something new. But first, I'd like to tell you about an exciting book series by this episode's sponsor. The Last Kids on Earth is a mega, best-selling illustrated series, perfect for kids ages 7 through 12. Join Jack, Quint, June, and Dirk, a band of suburban middle schoolers, as they battle zombies and other villains in the aftermath of the monster apocalypse. I highly recommend checking out these hilarious, action-packed books brought to you by Penguin Young Readers. Go grab your copy today. Now, it's time to get back to our own adventure ahead. Let's dive in.
Our story begins in 1941 in the city of Leningrad. Seagulls flew overhead as people traveled to work. Many of them walked alongside the river Neva, marching past the city's green parks and beautiful palaces. In the distance, they could see the dark puff of smoke coming from the factory chimneys. Many people were going to these factories where they helped build machines and ammunition. This was a very important job in 1941 because by this time, Europe was in the middle of its Second World War. Here's a quick history lesson about the Second World War. World War II, as it's often called, began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. After that, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. Over the next few years, more and more countries would join the battle. They would either side with the Allied powers, led by the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States, or the Axis powers, led by Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, the city of Leningrad was in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was in a very interesting position when the war first began. The nation's leader was a man named Joseph Stalin, and Stalin had made a pact with Germany that the Soviet Union and Germany would not fight each other for the next 10 years. But the leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler, did not intend to keep his promise. Hitler had a vision for a much bigger Germany. This vision was called the Lebensraum, which translates to living space. He believed Germany would conquer and take over lands and make the people living there more like Germans. As part of Lebensraum, Hitler set his sights on the Soviet Union. Even though the two nations had promised not to attack each other, Hitler planned an invasion. He called it Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, the German army marched into the Soviet Union, taking everyone by surprise. Over 3 million German soldiers had spread out across the border. They moved towards major cities like Moscow and Leningrad. Leningrad was a very important city during the war. It sits at the corner of the Baltic Sea with a bustling seaport. Ships carrying important supplies would come in and out of its harbor. It was also a place with many factories that made weapons and supplies for the Soviet army. When the German army invaded, the Soviet Union's people and soldiers were not prepared.
We did not expect any hostile actions from Germany. Not too long ago, we signed a peace treaty between countries.
One survivor named Helen Dovgialo remembered. The Soviet Union didn't believe an invasion would ever happen, and Hitler was counting on that. He wanted to take the country by surprise, and he believed that it would be a quick and easy victory. You'll soon find out Hitler was wrong about this. It wouldn't be easy or quick. During the summer of 1941, the German army moved in. In a matter of weeks, life in the Soviet Union drastically changed. In Leningrad, everyday people frantically dug trenches and built fortifications made of wire and timber to block any tanks from entering the city. About 500,000 citizens left to fight in the war or fled the city altogether. But even still, over 2.5 million remained in Leningrad. And in September, the lives of these people were about to be turned upside down. Hitler had sent out instructions to the German army. It is intended to encircle Leningrad, and to level it to the ground by any means of artillery bombardment, and continue bombing from the air. Hitler planned to destroy the city. In the early hours of the morning, German and Finnish soldiers launched a surprise attack on Leningrad. Armed with guns and tanks, soldiers quickly surrounded the city. Some of the residents fled their home in fear, but many were trapped. Leningrad citizens could hear the hum of German planes as they flew overhead. Then they heard explosions. These airplanes were dropping bombs. Shops and houses were destroyed in an instant. Later that day, people saw a huge cloud of smoke in the distance. They knew exactly what had happened. The German soldiers had lit a warehouse on fire. This warehouse held most of the city's food, including huge stores of flour and sugar. The people of Leningrad were worried there would not be enough to eat. More people raced to the train stations, hoping that they could catch a train out of the city to safety. But the German soldiers had already taken over the stations and stopped anyone from leaving. Then the soldiers blocked all the roads going in and out of the city. Now, the only route for supplies was across a lake near Leningrad called Lake Ladoga. It was nicknamed the Road of Life.
It's time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about our sponsor for this episode. The Last Kids on Earth is a #1 New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today best-selling illustrated series. Your kids will become obsessed with the series' main characters, a band of suburban middle schoolers battling zombies and other monsters as they try to save the world. It's the perfect series for any kid who's ever dreamed of starring in their own comic book or video game. There are 8 books out now, with more on the way. The series is available everywhere books are sold.
During the winter, sleds and trucks would drive over the frozen lake to deliver fuel and food to the people in the city, but it was still barely enough. Food became scarce, and soon many were starving. People had to wait in line all day and into the night to get a small amount of bread. Children and elderly people were just given 3 small slices of bread each day. By the time winter arrived, it had been weeks of living with little food, and people had become desperate. They began making soup from leather and hay. One teenager wrote in her diary,
"There is no worse feeling than when all of your thoughts are on food."
That first winter, the electricity was cut off, and people now had to find a way to stay warm. They began burning their books, furniture, and anything else they could find to make hot fires. During the freezing winter, the pipes froze, and the citizens of Leningrad now struggled to get enough clean water. By now, many had lost loved ones, and most were losing hope that life would not get better. "What will become of us?" one factory worker asked. Thankfully, the Soviet army was able to evacuate 500,000 people that winter across Lake Ladoga. But even still, 1 million people remained in Leningrad, fighting for their lives.
During that winter, I don't think I ever saw a person smile.
A Soviet officer remembered.
And yet, there was a kind of inner discipline that made people carry on.
Throughout this time, the people of Leningrad still experienced bombings and gunfire. Homes, factories, schools, and hospitals were destroyed. In February, the people's rations were increased for the first time. Finally, they were given a little bit more food.
You cannot imagine what a great day it was.
One woman remembered.
People on the street hugged and kissed one another. Only 3 ounces of bread were added, but the Leningrad citizens took this increase as a first sign of the coming complete victory.
And it was true. By 1942, the tide of the war was changing. The next year, Germany would face a huge defeat. Just over 1,000 miles from Leningrad, the Soviet Union's Red Army had beat the Germans in a deadly battle. This gave the people of the Soviet Union hope. As winter turned to spring, the air warmed and the snow melted, and people began planting gardens and parks and open spaces. Now they were able to grow their own fruits and vegetables. Food was still scarce, but the people believed that they had survived the worst of the siege. A composer named Dmitri Shostakovich had been living in Leningrad during the start of the siege. He spent those first days writing a symphony before he was evacuated. In the spring, as everyone was planting their gardens, Shostakovich had finished his symphony. He wanted it to be performed in Leningrad. By this time, the city orchestra had only about 14 musicians still living in Leningrad, and that was not enough. Posters were placed all around the city to recruit everyday people to join the orchestra.
All Leningrad musicians report to the radio committee.
The posters read. Like all the people in Leningrad, the musicians had grown weak and thin during the siege, but the chance to perform lifted their spirits. How those people livened up when we started to get them out of their dark apartments, one man remembered. That summer, the orchestra gathered with their violins, cellos, flutes, trumpets, and drums, and they began playing Shostakovich's symphony. The music filled the air and brought tears to the listeners' eyes. But this symphony wasn't just for the people of Leningrad. The performance was recorded and broadcast over loudspeakers, pointed directly at the German army. For Leningrad's citizens, the music was an important message. It was a message that they had survived, and that they weren't giving up. By the next year, the Red Army was able to build a railway line on land they had taken from the German army. This was life-changing. Before, the German army had blocked any roads and railways into Leningrad. With the new railroad, supplies could be sent to the city by train. Soon, more food and fuel arrived in Leningrad, and the city came back to life. Citizens were back in the factories, working hard to make machines and weapons for the Soviet army. As the war dragged on, things didn't look very good for Germany. The Red Army had pushed across German lines, and Hitler's men began to retreat. Then, on January 27, 1944, the Red Army forced the German soldiers out of the city. Finally, Leningrad was free, and the people had survived nearly 900 days under siege. Leningrad citizens ran out into the street, celebrating the good news. While they cheered this happy day, they remembered all those they had lost. We sang, we cried, we laughed, but it was sad all the same. The losses were just too large, one survivor remembered. Historians estimate that nearly 800,000 civilians did not survive the siege, and for many years the Soviet Union's government covered up this tragic event. Today we have the diaries of those who lived in Leningrad. Their writings tell us of what life was like during those difficult years. The Siege of Leningrad was an important moment in history. It shows us just how destructive war can be for everyday people. While soldiers were fighting in the battlefields, the people of Leningrad were fighting a battle of their own. Germany's plan had been to destroy the city, but against all odds, Leningrad survived. Even in the darkest of times, the citizens of Leningrad refused to give up, and for that, they will always be remembered.
Welcome back. I hope you learned something new from this important story. Had you heard about the Siege of Leningrad before? Most people haven't, and now you can go tell your teachers and friends all about it. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about important and inspiring stories from World War II, go check out issue 20 of Honest History magazine. You will learn all about often overlooked stories of bravery and courage in the face of immense hardships. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next time. This episode was hosted by Nariko Ott and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence and Robot Pirate Media. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, Visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's